Welcome, traveler. Tonight, leave the noise of the day behind. Find a quiet place, under soft covers, in a dim room, and breathe slowly. Imagine this with me. Far away, where the air is thin and sharp as glass, mountains rise like frozen waves. Their white peaks slice into a sky so blue it seems endless. These are the Himalayas, giants of stone and silence. But here's the secret that will keep you awake for just a little while. These giants were not always here. Once, this land lay hidden beneath warm, shallow seas. How did the ocean floor rise to scrape the sky? What power could move the bones of the earth? Stay close, and I'll tell you. Slowly, gently, until sleep finds you. And if you'd like to wander with me again, a quiet subscription means we'll keep traveling together. Now, let's begin. Let us drift back now, far back, to a time when Earth wore a completely different face, when our planet was younger, warmer, and arranged in ways that would seem impossible to us today. This is roughly 200 million years ago, during what geologists call the Mesozoic era, though we might simply think of it as the age when Earth was still learning how to be itself. Picture, if you will, a world where most of the land was gathered together into one massive supercontinent called Gondwana. Like a sleeping giant, this enormous landmass stretched across much of what we now call the Southern Hemisphere. Within its borders lay the future pieces of South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and there, nestled against what would one day become Antarctica, was a smaller piece of land that would eventually become India. But here's what's truly magical about this ancient world. Where the Himalayas stand today, there was something entirely different. Instead of snow-capped peaks scraping the sky, there was an ocean, vast, warm, and teeming with life. The Tethys Ocean, geologists call it, named after the ancient Greek goddess of the sea. For millions upon millions of years, this ocean stretched like a blue silk scarf between the northern continents and Gondwana, its waters lapping gently at shores that no longer exist. Imagine floating in those ancient waters on a warm afternoon 150 million years ago. The ocean around you would be clear and tropical, much like the Mediterranean or Caribbean today, but extending far beyond any horizon you could see. The water temperature would hover around a comfortable 75 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that you could drift here for hours without discomfort, watching the play of sunlight through the crystal-clear depths below. Below, in these gentle depths, countless sea creatures lived their entire evolutionary stories. Ammonites with spiral shells like nautical dreams drifted through the water columns, their shells catching and refracting the filtered sunlight into patterns of blue and gold. These creatures, relatives of today's octopus and squid, ruled these ancient seas with an elegance that seems almost dreamlike to us now. Some were no larger than coins, while others grew to the size of truck wheels, their shells spiraling outward in mathematical perfection that would inspire artists millions of years before art was invented. Massive marine reptiles moved through these waters like liquid thunder, plesiosaurs with necks longer than giraffes, gliding through the depths with the graceful efficiency of underwater birds. Ichthyosaurs, looking remarkably like dolphins though they evolved independently, cut through the waves with powerful tail flukes, their large eyes perfectly adapted for hunting in the dappled light of the tropical seas. These weren't the cold, harsh oceans we might imagine from our modern perspective of prehistoric times. This was a warm, abundant marine paradise that supported incredible diversity of life. The very stones that would one day form the peaks of the Himalayas were being born in these waters, grain by grain, shell by shell. Tiny organisms called foraminifera built microscopic shells of calcium carbonate, and when they died, these shells drifted down through the water like marine snow, settling on the ocean floor in layers so thin they were nearly invisible. But time is the great accumulator, and over millions of years, These microscopic shells built limestone beds hundreds of feet thick. Coral reefs stretched across vast areas of the Tethys, creating underwater cities of stunning beauty and complexity. These weren't the relatively small reef systems we know today, but massive formations that extended for thousands of miles, supporting ecosystems so rich and diverse that we can barely imagine them. Fish in colors that have no names swam through coral gardens where every surface bloomed with life. Sponges and sea fans, anemones and algae, creating a living tapestry that transformed sunlight into food and shelter for countless species. It's almost impossible to grasp, isn't it? That the very stone beneath Mount Everest's summit, that grey limestone that climbers touch when they reach the roof of the world, was once part of this ocean floor, formed from the shells and skeletons of creatures that knew only the embrace of warm seawater. The highest point on our planet carries within it the memory of the deepest seas, like a love letter written in stone and carried from the ocean floor to the sky. The climate then was gentle and subtropical across most of the planet, with no ice caps at either pole. Palm trees grew where London stands today, their fronds rustling in warm breezes that carried the scent of tropical flowers across landscapes we now consider cold and harsh. Dinosaurs wandered through forests where we now find tundra, leaving footprints in mud that would eventually become stone, preserving their passage through these ancient Edens. Cycads and ferns created forests of extraordinary lushness, their primitive beauty unmarred by the more aggressive flowering plants that would eventually dominate terrestrial ecosystems. These were forests that moved to different rhythms than our modern woodlands. Slower, more patient, adapted to a world where change came gradually and life had time to perfect itself in stable, warm conditions. There were no Himalayas to block the flow of air across continents, no great mountain ranges to wring moisture from the clouds and create the monsoon patterns that billions of people depend on today. Weather patterns flowed freely around the globe, creating a more uniform climate where seasonal variations were gentle and predictable. The great atmospheric rivers that bring rain to different parts of the world today simply didn't exist because the topographical barriers that create them hadn't been born yet. But even in this seemingly stable world, change was stirring with the patience of deep geological time. Far beneath the surface, currents in Earth's molten mantle moved like dreams in a sleeping mind, slow, powerful, and utterly patient. These currents, driven by the heat radiating from Earth's core, generated forces that would eventually crack the great supercontinent of Gondwana like an eggshell, setting in motion the events that would ultimately lift seafloors into the sky. The mantle beneath our planet's crust is not the static, solid mass we might imagine. Instead, it's a layer of rock heated to temperatures that would melt surface materials instantly, kept solid only by the enormous pressure of the overlying crust. This hot rock moves in vast, slow-motion currents called convection cells, rising where it's hottest, spreading horizontally as it cools, then sinking back toward the core to be reheated and begin the cycle again. These convection currents move at rates measured in centimeters per year, but they carry enough energy to reshape entire continents. As hot material rises beneath continental masses, it creates upward pressure that can stretch and eventually crack the overlying crust. When this happens, continents begin to pull apart, and new oceans are born in the gaps between them. The Tethys Ocean was not just a body of water, it was a nursery for the future mountains, unknowingly collecting and preparing the materials that would one day become some of Earth's highest peaks. Every grain of sediment that settled to its bottom was being catalogued and stored in layers that recorded not just the passage of time, but the changing conditions of an ancient world. During particularly warm periods, when sea levels rose and the ocean expanded, different types of sediments were deposited. During cooler times, when the ocean contracted slightly, the composition of the seafloor sediments changed accordingly. Each layer became a page in an enormous book written in stone, recording everything from climate changes to mass extinction events to the evolution of new species in the fossil record. The creatures of this ocean lived in a world of abundance that's difficult for us to imagine. The warm, clear waters supported not just the large, dramatic species we often think of when we picture ancient seas, but entire ecosystems of smaller organisms that formed the foundation of the marine food web. Microscopic algae turned sunlight into food with an efficiency that supported vast populations of tiny grazers, which in turn fed larger creatures in an unbroken chain of abundance that reached from the smallest bacteria to the largest marine reptiles. During the day, the Tethys would have sparkled under ancient sunlight, its waves carrying the same rhythmic music that oceans have always sung, but in frequencies and patterns we no longer hear. The sun itself shone with slightly different intensity then, and the composition of the atmosphere filtered its light in ways that painted the sky in colors we might not recognize, perhaps slightly more orange in the mornings, or deeper blue at midday, or touched with violet hues we've never seen. At night, the ocean would have reflected stars in constellations we no longer recognize, as the slow dance of continental drift gradually changed even the patterns in the sky. The moon was closer to Earth then, appearing larger in the sky and creating stronger tides that reached further inland, carving different patterns in the shores and creating tidal pools of extraordinary diversity and beauty. Storms would have swept across the Tethys's surface with the same fury that storms show today, generating waves that could reach enormous heights when they broke against the ancient shores. But these storms were part of a climate system more stable and predictable than what we experience today. They followed patterns established over millions of years, and the life in the ocean had adapted to their rhythms with the same precision that modern creatures adapt to seasonal changes. The shorelines of the Tethys were not the sharp boundaries between land and sea that we know today. Instead, they were vast, shallow areas, where the ocean floor sloped so gradually that the distinction between land and water became blurred. These shallows, warmed by the sun and rich in nutrients brought by rivers, became some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, supporting incredible diversity of life in environments that were part marine, part terrestrial, and entirely magical. And all the while, beneath the ocean floor, tectonic plates were beginning their slow dance toward the collision that would eventually create the Himalayas. The piece of land that would become India was still firmly attached to its neighbors, but the forces that would eventually tear it away were already building, like the slow intake of breath before a song begins. The Earth was preparing for one of the most dramatic transformations in its history, though it would unfold over millions of years with the patient inevitability of seasons changing into years, years into centuries, centuries into geological epochs. If you had stood on the shore of Gondwana during those ancient days and somehow possessed the gift of geological foresight, you might have sensed something stirring in the deep places of the world, perhaps a slightly different quality to the ground beneath your feet, or a subtle change in the rhythm of the waves, or simply an intuition that this seemingly eternal world was actually balanced on the edge of extraordinary change. This is one of the beautiful mysteries of deep time, how the most profound changes happen so gradually that they're invisible to any single lifetime, yet so powerfully that they reshape entire worlds. The Tethys Ocean seemed eternal, and in one sense it was. It existed far longer than our species has walked the earth, longer than mammals have existed, longer than flowering plants have bloomed. Yet it was also temporary, a passage in a longer story, a gentle prelude to the symphony of mountain building that was slowly, quietly, inevitably beginning to unfold in the patient depths of geological time. And so, we come to one of the most extraordinary journeys in Earth's history, a voyage that would make Odysseus weep with envy, though it unfolded at a pace that would make glaciers seem restless by comparison. About 180 million years ago, the great supercontinent of Gondwana began to break apart, and the piece of land we now call India embarked on an epic migration that would change the face of our world forever. Imagine, if you will, the moment when continents divorce. It doesn't happen with the dramatic crack of splitting wood or the sharp report of breaking ice that we might expect from our human-scale experience of things breaking apart. Instead, it begins with a whisper, a subtle stretching deep in the Earth's crust, a slight weakening along ancient lines of stress that have been building pressure for millions of years, as invisible and patient as the growth rings in an ancient tree. The land begins to pull apart so slowly that if you were an observer standing on the surface, you might notice nothing for thousands upon thousands of human lifetimes. Generations would live and die, entire civilizations would rise and fall, ice ages would come and go, and still the separation would be so gradual as to be imperceptible to any individual witness. This is the genius of geological time. It accomplishes the impossible through patience so profound it seems like stillness. But deep beneath the surface, something magnificent was stirring with the quiet power of inevitability itself. The Earth's mantle, that layer of hot, flowing rock that lies beneath the crust we walk on, was moving in vast, slow currents that carried more energy than all the storms and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in recorded history combined. Think of honey warming in morning sunlight, or thick cream swirling in a cup of coffee, and you begin to approach the languid majesty of these movements, though even these comparisons fall short of capturing the scale and patience of mantle convection. These currents don't rush toward their destinations like surface rivers hurrying towards the sea. Instead, they flow with the patience of eternity itself, carrying enough power to crack continents and birth oceans, yet moving so slowly that their effects are measured not in years or centuries, but in millions of years. Time scales so vast, they challenge our ability to comprehend them even intellectually, let alone emotionally. The Indian landmass, at this point still connected to what would become Madagascar and Antarctica, like pieces of an enormous jigsaw puzzle that had been stable for hundreds of millions of years, began to feel the pull of these deep currents. The connection between India and its neighbors had existed for so long that it seemed as permanent as anything on Earth could be, yet beneath this apparent stability, forces were building that would eventually prove irresistible. Gradually, almost tenderly, the Earth began to stretch and thin along what would become the future boundary between India and the rest of Gondwana. This stretching didn't happen uniformly. Some areas pulled apart faster than others, creating a complex pattern of rifts and valleys that gradually widened over millions of years. Magma rose from the depths like warm breath made visible, finding pathways through the thinning crust and creating new ocean floor as it cooled and solidified. Picture this extraordinary moment in Earth's history. Slowly, over millions of years, a gap appeared between India and the rest of Gondwana. At first, it was just a narrow valley, perhaps similar to the modern East African Rift, where the land had dropped slightly and water had begun to collect in the depression. But as the stretching continued, this valley widened and deepened, and seawater from the surrounding oceans began to rush in to fill the growing space. The Indian Ocean was being born, and India found itself transformed from an interior piece of a vast supercontinent into something unprecedented. An island continent, surrounded by water and free to wander across the Earth's surface according to the whims of the deep currents beneath it. This transformation from landlocked interior to oceanic island was one of the most dramatic changes in geological status that any piece of land can experience. And wander India did, with a purpose and direction that seems almost miraculous when we consider the vast scales involved. The Indian plate, carrying its cargo of ancient rocks and future mountains, began moving northward across the newly formed Indian Ocean and the ancient Tethys beyond it at what might seem like a snail's pace to our impatient human perspective, about 10 centimeters per year, roughly the speed at which your fingernails grow. But here's where the magic of geological time reveals itself. Multiply that tiny movement by millions of years, and you get one of the most remarkable migrations in our planet's history. By the standards of continental drift, India was racing northward at breakneck speed, covering distances that would eventually total thousands of miles. To put this in perspective, if India had been moving at its ancient pace since the founding of Rome, it would have traveled nearly 200 miles, enough to relocate an entire country. As India sailed across the ancient oceans, it carried with it a remarkable cargo that tells one of the most beautiful stories in the history of life on Earth. On its surface rode entire ecosystems that had evolved during India's time as part of Gondwana. Forests of cycads and conifers, early flowering plants that were just beginning to experiment with the explosion of color and form that would eventually dominate terrestrial plant life, and early mammals and dinosaurs that had no idea they were passengers on a geological ark. These creatures were unknowingly embarked on a journey that would transport them from the southern latitudes where they had evolved to eventually collide with entirely different ecosystems in the north. Species that had developed in isolation on Gondwana would eventually encounter Asian species that had evolved along completely different pathways, creating opportunities for evolutionary exchange and competition that would reshape the biological history of both continents. The journey was not a smooth cruise across calm seas, despite the gentle way we often imagine geological processes unfolding. The Indian plate plowed through the Tethys Ocean like a massive ship with a hull made of continental crust, its leading edge interacting with the seafloor in complex ways that created a variety of geological features. In some places, the dense oceanic crust dove beneath India's lighter continental rocks in a process called subduction, disappearing into the Earth's mantle like a heavy curtain sinking beneath a lighter one. In other areas, pieces of the ocean floor were scraped off and plastered onto India's leading edge, adding exotic rocks to the continent's geological collection like souvenirs gathered during a long voyage. These accreted terrains, as geologists call them, brought with them fossils and rock types that told the story of ancient ocean basins and island chains that no longer exist except as fragments incorporated into India's continental margin. Volcanic activity marked India's passage across the ocean like a trail of breadcrumbs in a cosmic fairy tale. As the continent moved over hot spots in the Earth's mantle, stationary plumes of hot material rising from near the core, massive volcanic eruptions created underwater mountains and island chains that rose from the ocean floor like stepping stones across the deep. One of the most spectacular examples of this volcanic activity occurred when India passed over what is now called the Reunion hotspot. The interaction between the moving continent and the stationary mantle plume created some of the largest volcanic eruptions in Earth's history, pouring out enough lava to cover an area the size of modern India with basalt flows thousands of feet thick. These eruptions were so massive that they may have affected global climate, pumping sulfur and ash into the atmosphere in quantities that dimmed the sun and cooled temperatures worldwide. During this epic voyage, India passed through different climate zones as it moved from southern to northern latitudes, creating a natural laboratory for studying how life responds to gradual environmental change. Fossils tell us that the continent experienced tropical conditions during much of its journey, with warm, humid climates that supported lush forests and abundant wildlife. But as India moved northward, it gradually encountered more temperate conditions, and the species living on the continent had to adapt to changing temperatures and seasonal patterns. This climatic journey created unique evolutionary pressures that shaped the development of Indian flora and fauna. Species that evolved in the stable, warm conditions of Gondwana found themselves adapting to more variable northern climates, developing characteristics that would later prove advantageous when India finally collided with Asia and its species encountered entirely new, competitive pressures. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of India's journey was its destination. This wasn't a random wandering across empty ocean. India was being drawn northward by the same fundamental forces that had set it free from Gondwana in the first place. The northward motion was part of a larger pattern of convection in the Earth's mantle that was slowly rearranging the planet's surface configuration according to the deep thermal dynamics of our planet's interior. India was following invisible currents deep beneath the Earth, guided by forces as fundamental as gravity itself, but operating on scales so vast they dwarf our everyday experience. The continent was like a leaf carried by a river, except the river was made of molten rock, flowing thousands of miles beneath the surface, and the leaf was a piece of land the size of modern India, carrying millions of years of evolutionary history on its back. As tens of millions of years passed, the gap between India and Asia grew steadily smaller, like a slowly closing door that would eventually bring together two worlds that had been separate since the breakup of the ancient supercontinents. The Tethys, ocean, which had seemed so vast and permanent, began to shrink as its shores approached each other from north and south with the inevitability of a slow-motion embrace. What had once been a journey across open water became a voyage toward an inevitable rendezvous that would reshape both continents. The seafloor of the Tethys, which had been accumulating sediments and supporting marine ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years, was destined to be caught between the approaching land masses and transformed from the bottom of a tropical sea into the highest mountains on Earth. The creatures living in the Tethys during this time witnessed, though they could never have understood the implications, one of the most dramatic changes in Earth's geography since the formation of the continents themselves. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ocean that had been their world for millions of years was being squeezed out of existence by forces so vast and patient that no single generation of any species could perceive the change. The seafloor that had been home to countless generations of marine life was destined to be crumpled and lifted into the sky, transformed from the deepest, most stable part of their world into heights that would eventually scrape the ceiling of the atmosphere itself. Ancient coral reefs would become mountain peaks, deep ocean sediments would become high alpine meadows, and the limestone formed from countless microscopic shells would become the grey rock that mountaineers touch when they stand on the summits of the world's highest mountains. Yet even as India approached Asia with increasing inevitability, the pace remained majestically, almost impossibly slow by human standards. Entire forests had time to grow, evolve, and disappear during the approach. Mountain ranges rose and eroded away on other continents, while India continued its patient journey northward. Ice ages came and went, leaving no trace on the tropical continent as it drifted through latitudes where winter was just a brief cooling rather than the harsh season we know in northern climates. Entire groups of animals evolved from primitive forms into complex, sophisticated communities, then vanished from the fossil record, leaving only their bones and shells to mark their passage through deep time. All while India continued its patient journey northward, carrying the future Himalayas in its geological luggage, like seeds of mountains waiting for the right conditions to sprout and grow toward the sky. Think of the incredible forces required to move an entire continent across thousands of miles of ocean. The energy involved defies easy comprehension. It's like imagining the power needed to slide a massive coin across a table, except the coin is the size of a modern country, and the table is an ocean of molten rock, flowing thousands of miles beneath the surface of the Earth. Yet the Earth manages these feats of geological engineering with casual grace, the way a sleeping person shifts position in bed without waking, unconscious of the complex mechanics involved, but perfectly capable of accomplishing movements that would be impossible if attempted consciously. Our planet has been moving continents around its surface for billions of years with the same effortless competence that we use to breathe or digest food, automatic, unconscious, and utterly reliable. As India drew closer to Asia, the character of its journey began to change in ways that would prove crucial to the eventual formation of the Himalayas. The leading edge of the Indian plate encountered the continental margin of Asia, and the nature of the collision began to shift from the opening of oceans to their closing, from the birth of new seafloor to its destruction and transformation. The Tethys Ocean, trapped between the approaching continents like water being squeezed from a sponge, began its final chapter, though that chapter would still take millions of years to complete, unfolding with the same patient inevitability that had characterized the entire journey from the beginning. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic and beautiful events in Earth's history. Two ancient landmasses, each carrying billions of years of geological history in their rocky memories, were approaching each other with the inevitability of a cosmic slow-motion dance. The collision, when it finally came, would be gentle by human standards, but absolutely transformative by any geological measure, a meeting that would lift the floor of an ancient ocean into the highest mountains on Earth, creating a barrier so tall it would change weather patterns across the entire planet. But we're getting ahead of ourselves in the excitement of anticipating this cosmic collision. For now, India continues its majestic voyage, carrying its cargo of future mountains across the shrinking Tethys, moving toward a destiny that will reshape both continents and, in doing so, create some of the most beautiful and dramatic landscapes our planet has ever known. The ancient seafloor beneath the ocean, heavy with the accumulated sediments of millions of years, waits patiently to be lifted into the sky, unaware that it carries within its layers the raw materials for peaks that will one day pierce the very roof of the world. And so we arrive at the moment that changed everything, though moment hardly seems the right word for an event that unfolded over tens of millions of years with the stately grace of a cosmic ballet choreographed by forces beyond human comprehension. About 50 million years ago, India finally completed its epic journey across the Tethys Ocean and began to collide with Asia in what would become one of the most beautiful examples of geological transformation in our planet's history. This was not the violent crash we might imagine when we think of continent-sized masses colliding at planetary scales. There were no thunderous impacts echoing across the ancient landscape, no sudden cataclysms that reshaped the world in moments of dramatic violence. Instead, this was a slow, inexorable embrace that unfolded with the patience of deep time itself, a coming together so gentle it could only be perceived across millions of years, yet so powerful it would ultimately reshape both continents and give birth to the highest mountains on Earth. Picture, if you will, what it might have been like to witness the very beginning of this collision from some impossible vantage point high above the Earth, blessed with the gift of seeing geological time compressed into observable moments. You would have seen two massive landmasses approaching each other across a steadily narrowing ocean, like two sleeping giants slowly rolling toward each other across an enormous bed, their movement so gradual it seemed more like a dream than a physical process. The leading edges of both continents were not the sharp, defined coastlines we know today, carved by waves and weathered by storms into dramatic cliffs and beaches. Instead, they were gentle continental shelves that sloped gradually into the sea over distances of hundreds of miles, creating vast, shallow areas where the distinction between land and water became beautifully blurred. These shallow seas, warmed by tropical sunlight and rich in nutrients, supported some of the most diverse marine ecosystems Earth has ever known. As India's northern edge first touched the southern margin of Asia, something extraordinary began to happen to the seafloor between them that reveals one of the most profound truths about how our planet works. The Tethys Ocean, which had existed for hundreds of millions of years as a stable feature of Earth's geography, suddenly found itself in an impossible situation that would test the very laws of physics that govern how materials behave under extreme pressure. Ocean crust, being denser and heavier than continental crust, normally slides beneath continents when they meet, disappearing into the Earth's mantle like a heavy cloth sinking beneath lighter fabric floating on water. This process, called subduction, is one of the fundamental mechanisms by which our planet recycles its surface materials, sending old seafloor back into the depths to be remelted and eventually returned to the surface through volcanic activity. But here, in this ancient collision zone, something unprecedented was happening. Two continental masses were approaching each other, and neither was willing or able to yield to the other's passage. Continental crust, being lighter and more buoyant than oceanic crust, simply cannot be forced down into the mantle in the same way. When continents collide, they must find other ways to accommodate the incredible forces involved, and the solution they found would prove to be one of the most beautiful examples of geological compromise in Earth's history. Instead of one continent simply overriding the other in a simple, brutal conquest, both began to deform, to fold and buckle and rise, like two soft quilts being slowly pushed together on a bed by invisible hands. The result was not destruction, but creation, the birth of new landscapes that would eventually become some of the most spectacular mountain scenery our planet has ever produced. The ocean floor between them, that ancient repository of countless shells and sediments, the limestone legacy of millions of years of marine life, the accumulated diary of an entire ocean written in layers of stone, found itself caught in this continental embrace and slowly, inexorably lifted skyward in a process so gradual it seemed like magic, so patient it required millions of years to accomplish what seems impossible even in theory. Imagine standing on what would one day become the summit of Mount Everest during those early stages of collision, though of course there was no summit yet, and you would have been standing underwater on the bottom of a shallow tropical sea. The water around you would have been crystal clear and pleasantly warm, probably around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, teeming with the last generations of marine creatures that would ever live in the gradually disappearing Tethys Ocean. Schools of ancient fish swam in lazy circles above what would one day be the highest point on Earth, their scales catching and reflecting the filtered sunlight that penetrated the clear water in shafts of gold and blue. Corals grew in fantastic formations on the seafloor that was already beginning its impossible journey toward the sky, though the movement was so slow that countless generations of coral polyps lived and died without detecting the slightest change in their world. Ammonites drifted through the water like living nautilus shells, their tentacles trailing behind them as they pursued prey through three-dimensional underwater landscapes that existed in perfect stability, yet were balanced on the edge of one of the most dramatic transformations in geological history. These creatures had no way of knowing that they were witnesses to the end of an era, the final chapters in the biography of an ocean that had existed since before complex life evolved on land. The collision didn't happen all at once along the entire margin where India met Asia, creating a complex pattern of mountain building that we can still read in the rocks today, like chapters in an enormous stone book, written in a language of pressure and heat, folding and faulting. Instead, it began in the west and gradually progressed eastward, like a slow zipper closing between the two continents, each section coming together according to its own timeline and local conditions. As each section of the continental margin came together, the the character of the collision changed slightly, creating different patterns of deformation that reflected the varying geology of different parts of both continents. Some areas were composed of hard, ancient rocks that resisted deformation and created high, sharp peaks. Other areas contained softer sedimentary rocks that folded more easily, creating the gentler, more rounded mountains that characterize certain parts of the Himalayan range. The forces involved in this collision were almost incomprehensible when we try to translate them into terms we can relate to from our human-scale experience. The entire Indian subcontinent, millions of square miles of solid rock carrying billions of years of geological history, was being driven northward by the same deep mantle currents that had carried it across thousands of miles of ocean. When this irresistible force encountered the immovable barrier of Asia, the result was a perfect example of what happens when geological forces reach scales that dwarf anything we experience in our everyday lives. Think of what happens when you push two pieces of soft modeling clay together with your hands. They don't simply stop when they meet. Instead, they deform, creating wrinkles and folds and raised areas where the material has nowhere to go but up or to the sides. The collision between India and Asia worked in much the same way, except the clay was solid rock, and the forces involved were powerful enough to lift entire mountain ranges thousands of feet into the air over periods of millions of years. As the collision progressed with the inevitability of a very slow avalanche, the Tethys Ocean began to disappear, not by draining away like water from a bathtub, but by being absorbed into the growing mountain range in one of the most remarkable transformations in geological history. The seafloor itself, along with all the sediments and limestone that had accumulated there over hundreds of millions of years, was being incorporated into the rising peaks like ingredients being folded into an enormous geological cake. Ancient beaches that had known the gentle lapping of tropical waves became mountain slopes where snow would fall for millions of years to come. Coral reefs that had grown in crystal-clear seas found themselves lifted to elevations where the air would become too thin for most complex life to survive. Deep ocean basins that had been home to creatures adapted to high pressure and eternal darkness were transformed into high mountain valleys where the sun would shine with an intensity filtered only by the thin atmosphere of extreme altitude. The early Himalayas that emerged from this collision were not the sharp, dramatic peaks we know today that seem to cut the sky itself with their knife-edge ridges and precipitous faces. Instead, they rose as broad, rounded highlands, more like gentle hills than towering mountains, their slopes clothed in vegetation adapted to the warm, humid climate that characterized the region during the early stages of the collision. The dramatic sculpting that would create the jagged ridges and soaring summits we associate with the Himalayas would come later, carved by millions of years of erosion by wind, water, and ice, working with the same patient persistence that had lifted the mountains in the first place. But even these early, gentle mountains represented one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. The conversion of seafloor into highland in a process so gradual it seemed like a dream unfolding in geological time, yet so complete it literally turned the world upside down. One of the most remarkable aspects of this collision was its effect on the Indian plate itself, which didn't simply stop when it encountered Asia, but continued pushing northward with the same relentless force that had carried it across thousands of miles of ocean. As India encountered the resistance of Asia, the northern part of the subcontinent began to slide beneath the southern margin of Tibet, a process geologists call subduction, though it was unlike the normal subduction of oceanic plates. Because continental crust is too light and buoyant to sink very deep into the Earth's mantle, this subduction was shallow and incomplete, creating a complex zone of crustal thickening and folding that extended hundreds of miles from the actual collision zone. The result was that the collision didn't just create mountains along the border between India and Asia. It affected vast areas of both continents, transforming the geology and topography across regions the size of entire countries. The Tibetan Plateau, that vast highland that stretches for thousands of miles north of the Himalayas, like an elevated plain suspended between earth and sky, owes its existence to this collision. As India pushed northward with unstoppable force, it caused the entire southern part of Asia to buckle and rise, creating the highest and largest plateau on Earth, a roof of the world that stands an average of 15,000 feet above sea level and covers an area larger than the entire continental United States. This plateau didn't rise all at once in some dramatic geological event, but was lifted gradually over millions of years as the collision continued and India kept pushing deeper into Asia. The process was like slowly inflating an enormous balloon beneath the surface of the continent, gradually lifting vast areas of land to elevations where the air becomes thin and the climate changes from temperate to alpine to Arctic conditions, despite being located at relatively low latitudes. But perhaps the most poetic aspect of this great collision was the way it preserved, in stone, the memory of the vanished ocean in a form that seems almost miraculous when we contemplate its implications. Today, when mountaineers climb to the summit of Mount Everest, they are walking on limestone that formed from marine creatures in the Tethys Ocean millions of years ago. The highest point on Earth is made of seafloor, a fact so wonderfully paradoxical that it seems like something from a dream or a myth rather than a scientific reality. This limestone contains fossils of crinoids and brachiopods, ammonites and corals, all creatures that lived their entire lives in warm, shallow seas, and never imagined that their shells would one day rest at elevations where the air is so thin that unacclimatized humans lose consciousness within minutes. The ocean didn't simply disappear when the continents collided. It was transformed, lifted into the sky, where it continues to exist as the backbone of the world's highest mountains. As millions of years passed and the collision continued with the same inexorable force that had characterized it from the beginning, the character of the mountains began to change in ways that would eventually create the spectacular landscapes we associate with the Himalayas today. The broad, gentle highlands gave way to steeper slopes as erosion began to carve valleys between the rising peaks, creating the dramatic relief that makes these mountains so visually striking. Rivers born from melting snow and seasonal rains cut deeper and deeper channels into the rising landscape, while the mountains themselves continued to rise in response to the ongoing collision, locked in an eternal dance between the forces building them up and the forces tearing them down. This dance continues today, with the mountains growing taller even as erosion works to level them, creating a dynamic equilibrium that has sustained some of the most spectacular mountain scenery on Earth for millions of years. The collision also had profound effects on global climate patterns that extend far beyond the immediate region of the mountains themselves. As the Himalayas rose, they began to block the flow of air masses across the continent, creating the monsoon system that brings life-giving rains to billions of people across South and Southeast Asia. The mountains became a vast wall that forced moisture-laden air to rise and cool, dropping its rain on the southern slopes while creating dry conditions to the north, in what is now Tibet and Central Asia. This transformation of climate patterns affected not just the regions immediately around the mountains, but weather systems across much of the northern hemisphere. The creation of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau changed the way heat and moisture circulate in the atmosphere, possibly contributing to the onset of ice ages and certainly affecting the evolution of life across vast areas of Asia and beyond. Through it all, the collision continued with the same patient inevitability that had characterized the entire process from the beginning, driven by forces so fundamental and persistent that they seem more like laws of nature than temporary geological events. India kept pushing northward at a rate of several centimeters per year, Asia kept resisting with the immovable stability of a continent, and the mountains kept rising, growing taller and more complex with each passing million years. The great collision that began 50 million years ago continues today. The Himalayas are still rising, still growing, still being pushed skyward by the slow but inexorable embrace of two ancient continents. GPS stations scattered across the region can measure this ongoing growth in real time, recording the gradual increase in elevation that continues to lift these mountains higher into the sky with each passing year. This is perhaps the most beautiful lesson of the Himalayan collision story, that the most dramatic changes often happen so slowly they seem like stillness to any observer living within them, that the most powerful forces work with patience rather than violence, and that even the tallest mountains are simply seafloors that learned, over millions of years of gradual pressure and patient lifting, to touch the sky and hold conversations with the stars. Now comes perhaps the most magical chapter in our mountain story, the long, patient process by which the gentle highlands born from the collision between India and Asia gradually transformed into the soaring peaks that pierce today's sky like stone prayers reaching toward infinity. This transformation didn't happen overnight, or even over millennia in any sense we could recognize, but across millions of years, each generation of mountains growing taller, more dramatic, more breathtakingly beautiful than the last in a slow-motion symphony of geological creation. Imagine, if you will, time-lapse photography that could capture millions of years in a single sweeping sequence. You would see the early Himalayas rising from the vanished Tethys like sleeping giants awakening to greet the dawn, their rounded shoulders gradually sharpening into ridges that cut the sky itself, their gentle slopes steepening into the knife-edge faces that challenge today's mountaineers with their austere beauty and technical difficulty. It would be like watching sculptures emerge from rough stone under the patient hands of cosmic artists working with tools of wind and water, ice and time, each working with such dedication and precision that every ridge and valley, every cliff and cirque becomes a masterpiece of natural architecture. The artists worked slowly, so slowly that entire species evolved and went extinct during the carving of a single peak, yet with such persistence that they eventually created landscapes of almost supernatural beauty. The collision between India and Asia didn't simply create mountains and then stop, satisfied with its initial accomplishment. Instead, it established a pattern of forces that continues to this day, a slow but relentless push that keeps lifting the Himalayas higher, even as erosion works constantly to wear them down, grain by grain, year by year. Think of it as an eternal contest between the Earth's internal forces, which build mountains through the patient application of unimaginable pressure, and its surface forces, which level them through the equally patient application of wind, water, and ice. In the Himalayas, the builders have been winning this contest for 50 million years, though the competition remains beautifully balanced, creating a dynamic equilibrium that sustains some of the most dramatic mountain landscapes on Earth. The mountains grow taller even as they're being eroded, like dancers maintaining perfect balance while constantly moving, creating a stability that emerges from perpetual change rather than from stillness. As India continued its northward push with the unstoppable momentum of continental drift, the geological situation beneath the collision zone became increasingly complex and fascinating in ways that challenge our understanding of how solid matter behaves under extreme conditions. The Indian plate didn't simply crumple against Asia and stop like a car hitting a wall. Instead, it began to slide beneath the southern edge of Tibet, in a process that thickened the crust beneath the collision zone to almost twice its normal thickness. Imagine trying to slide one thick book underneath another that's resting on a table. The result is a pile much thicker than either book alone, and that pile pushes upward with a force proportional to its increased mass. This is essentially what happened to the Earth's crust beneath the Himalayas, creating a foundation deep and strong enough to support the highest mountains on our planet, while providing the buoyant force necessary to keep pushing them higher into the increasingly thin air of the upper atmosphere. But the story of the rising mountains is not just about tectonic forces pushing upward with the blind persistence of geological processes. Equally important, and perhaps more poetic, is the role of erosion in sculpting the dramatic landscapes we see today through the patient artistry of water and ice working across millions of years to reveal the essential beauty hidden within the rising stone. As the mountains rose, they created their own weather patterns in one of the most beautiful examples of how geological and atmospheric processes can work together to create something more magnificent than either could accomplish alone. The rising peaks began capturing moisture from the air, concentrating it as rain and snow on their slopes in patterns that would eventually become some of the most important hydrological systems on Earth. Picture the early Himalayas as broad, gentle highlands clothed in warm weather vegetation, more like the rolling hills of ancient Appalachian or modern Tuscany than the stark, dramatic peaks that scrape today's sky. These highlands would have been covered in forests of cycads and conifers, early flowering plants, and ferns creating a green landscape of almost tropical lushness under skies that knew no winter in any sense we would recognize. But as these highlands continued to rise millimeter by millimeter, year by year, they began to experience the gradual cooling that comes with elevation, a process so slow it was imperceptible to any living observer, yet so persistent it eventually transformed subtropical lowlands into alpine heights, where only the hardiest plants and animals could survive. Snow began to fall on the highest peaks during what had once been merely cool seasons, and with snow came the next phase of mountain building, the formation of glaciers. These glaciers would prove to be some of the most powerful sculptors in the entire mountain-building process, working like slow-motion chisels operated by artists with infinite patience and an eye for dramatic beauty. Rivers of ice began to flow down the mountainsides like frozen waterfalls moving in extreme slow motion, carving away rock grain by grain, year by year, with a patience that makes geological time seem rushed by comparison. Glaciers work on mountains in ways that are fundamentally different from the erosive power of liquid water, though both are expressions of the same hydrological cycle that moves water between earth and sky in an endless dance of evaporation and precipitation. Unlike rivers, which primarily erode by carrying away loose material that has already been weathered free from solid rock, glaciers work like enormous rasps or files, grinding directly against the bedrock with incredible force and methodical persistence. As ice flows downslope under the influence of gravity, it plucks away loose rocks from the valley floor and walls, incorporates them into the flowing ice mass, and uses them as tools to grind against solid stone with a braiding power that can carve through the hardest granite given sufficient time. The result is a gradual carving away of material that shapes valleys and ridges with the precision of master sculptors working in 3 dimensions. The same peaks that had once been rounded hills gradually acquired the knife-edge ridges and precipitous faces that make them seem to pierce the sky itself like stone spears thrown by giants. This transformation happened as glaciers flowing down different sides of the mountains gradually carved away material from all directions, like sculptors working from multiple angles simultaneously to reveal the essential form hidden within the raw stone. Picture, if you will, the gradual transformation of a broad, rounded mountain into the sharp pyramid of a peak, like Everest or K2, a process that required millions of years of patient sculpting by ice and weather. This transformation happened as glaciers flowing down different faces of the mountain gradually carved away material from all sides, creating the dramatic ridges and faces that give these peaks their architectural quality. their sense of having been designed rather than merely formed by natural processes. The cirques, those bowl-shaped depressions where glaciers begin their journey downslope, cut deeper and deeper into the mountain's flanks over millions of years, like enormous spoons gradually carving away material from all directions. Eventually, these circular basins carved so deeply into the mountains from multiple directions that only the narrow ridges between them remained, creating the dramatic skylines that seemed to cut the very air itself into geometric patterns of stone and sky. As millions of years passed and this process continued, the Himalayas began to develop their characteristic structure that we can still observe today. A series of roughly parallel ranges running east to west, each higher than the last as you move northward from the Indian plains toward the heart of Asia. This structure reflects the complex geology of the collision zone and the different ways various types of rock responded to the enormous pressures and temperatures involved in continental collision. The southernmost ranges, closest to the Indian subcontinent, rose first as India's leading edge encountered Asia's southern margin. These mountains are now heavily eroded and relatively low compared to the ranges behind them, worn down by millions of additional years of weathering and erosion as they've been exposed to the elements longer than their northern neighbors. Behind these first ranges, the high Himalayas stretch like a wall of stone and ice, culminating in the highest peaks on Earth, Everest, K2, Kangchenjunga, and their companions that form the backbone of the range and contain most of the peaks that rise above 8,000 meters into the death zone, where human life cannot be sustained without artificial assistance. And behind the high Himalayas again lies the Tibetan Plateau, that vast highland that serves as the foundation for the entire mountain system, like a massive table supporting the world's highest peaks. This plateau, larger than the entire continental United States and averaging more than 15,000 feet above sea level, represents perhaps the most dramatic example of continental collision effects, showing how the impact between India and Asia affected not just the immediate contact zone, but vast areas of both continents. The process of mountain building also created some of the most spectacular geological formations on Earth, rock structures so complex and beautiful they seem more like abstract art than natural formations. The Himalayas contain rocks that have been folded into impossible shapes that challenge our understanding of how solid matter can behave, thrust far from their origins by forces that moved entire mountain ranges hundreds of miles from where they originally formed. Some rocks have been subjected to pressures and temperatures that would seem to belong more to the interior of planets than to their surfaces. Yet here they are, exposed to the sky on the roof of the world like geological secrets revealed by the patient excavation of erosion. Near Mount Everest, geologists have found rocks containing minerals that could only have formed at depths of more than 60 miles beneath the surface, yet here they rest at elevations where the air is too thin for most complex life to survive. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the rising Himalayas is the way they began to influence climate patterns across the entire planet, in a beautiful example of how local geological processes can have global consequences. As the mountains grew taller with each passing million years, they created an increasingly effective barrier to the flow of air across the continents, fundamentally altering atmospheric circulation patterns that had been stable for hundreds of millions of years. Moisture-laden winds from the Indian Ocean, which had previously flowed freely across the landscape in predictable seasonal patterns, now encountered this wall of stone and ice that forced them to rise into colder altitudes where their invisible cargo of water vapor condensed into clouds and fell as precipitation. The air was forced upward by the mountains, where it cooled and dropped its moisture as rain and snow on the southern slopes of the range. This process created the monsoon system that now dominates weather patterns across South and Southeast Asia, bringing life-giving rains to regions that support more than 1 billion people today. The same mountains that were born from an ancient ocean now control the flow of water across vast areas of land, bringing monsoon rains to some regions while creating rain shadows and high-altitude deserts in others. The Himalayas don't just rise into the sky, they shape the very sky itself, controlling where clouds form and where rain falls across much of Asia in a beautiful demonstration of how solid Earth and fluid atmosphere work together to create the conditions that make life possible on our planet. As the mountains continued to rise with the same patient persistence that had characterized their growth from the beginning, they also began to influence ocean currents and global weather patterns in ways that scientists are still discovering and studying. The uplift of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau changed the way heat and moisture move around our planet, possibly contributing to ice ages and certainly affecting the evolution of life across vast areas of Asia and regions far beyond. The high altitude of the Tibetan Plateau creates what meteorologists call a heat island during summer months, when the vast highland absorbs and reflects solar energy in ways that create powerful updrafts and atmospheric disturbances. These disturbances affect weather patterns as far away as Europe and North America, showing how mountain building in one region can influence climate across entire hemispheres. Through all these changes and influences, individual peaks continued their patient climb toward greater heights with the same methodical persistence that had lifted them from ancient sea floors to their current elevations. Mount Everest, K2, Kanchenjunga, and their companions grew taller year by year, millimeter by millimeter, their summits rising like stone prayers into the thin air of the upper atmosphere, where jet aircraft cruise and the sky begins its gradual transition towards the black of space. Each peak developed its own character during this long rise towards the sky, shaped by local patterns of rock type, weather, and erosion, yet all part of the same grand process that continues to lift ancient sea floor towards the stars. Some mountains composed of harder rocks maintained steeper faces and sharper ridges. Others, carved from softer materials, developed the more rounded profiles that characterize certain parts of the range. The mathematics of this rising are almost poetic in their precision and persistence. The Himalayas continue to grow at a rate of about 4 millimeters per year, roughly the width of a pencil lead annually, a measurement so small it seems insignificant until we multiply it by the vast scales of geological time. Over the course of just 1 million years, this seemingly tiny rate of growth would add more than 4,000 feet to mountain heights, enough to transform hills into peaks and peaks into giants that scrape the ceiling of our breathable atmosphere. Yet over geological time, this rate of growth is actually quite rapid, demonstrating the incredible forces still at work beneath these ancient mountains. In the context of Earth's history, the Himalayas are young, dynamic mountains still in the vigorous phase of their growth, still responding actively to the collision between India and Asia that shows no signs of slowing down. And so the mountains continue their ancient dance towards the sky, balanced always between the forces that build them up and the forces that wear them down, each peak a testament to the incredible patience and power of our living planet. They rise like stone symphonies, each ridge and valley a note in a composition that has been playing for millions of years and will continue long after we have learned to listen to its deeper harmonies and understand its profound lessons about time, patience, and the beautiful inevitability of geological change. The story of their rising is really the story of how our planet expresses its deepest creative impulses through the patient sculpture of stone and ice, showing us that the most beautiful and lasting achievements often require not just power, but the kind of patience that can work steadily toward a goal across millions of years, never hurrying, never stopping, always moving toward greater heights with the confidence that time makes all transformations possible. As the Himalayas rose toward their destined heights through millions of years of patient geological sculpture, they became the architects of their own extraordinary beauty, creating conditions that would transform them from broad, gentle highlands into the dramatic landscapes that capture our imagination today. The mountains didn't simply grow taller in isolation. They learned to capture water from the sky and transform it into the most patient and persistent of artists. Rivers that carved valleys with liquid persistence, glaciers that sculpted peaks with frozen patience, and the eternal dance of snow and ice that crowned the highest summits with white mantles that seemed to connect earth directly to heaven. Let us drift for a moment to the southern slopes of these growing mountains, where something remarkable was happening to the very air itself that would transform not just the local landscape, but weather patterns across much of Asia. As moisture-laden winds from the Indian Ocean encountered the rising wall of stone, they were forced upward into cooler altitudes where their invisible cargo of water vapor began to condense into clouds and then into the rain that would reshape continents. This was the birth of one of the most important weather patterns on Earth, the South Asian monsoon, born from the marriage of ancient ocean winds and newborn mountains, in a beautiful example of how geological and atmospheric processes can work together to create systems more complex and beautiful than either could produce alone. The monsoon didn't emerge suddenly, but developed gradually over millions of years as the mountains grew tall enough to effectively block and redirect the flow of air across the continent. Picture these early monsoon rains falling on landscapes that had never known such abundance of water, transforming dry highlands into some of the most fertile and well-watered regions on Earth. The precipitation was not evenly distributed across the mountain range. The southern faces of the mountains received torrential rains during the monsoon seasons, while the northern slopes, sheltered by the peaks themselves in what meteorologists call a rain shadow effect, remained relatively dry. This difference in rainfall began to carve the character of different regions with the precision of a master sculptor working in climate and geography. The contrast created the lush green valleys of Nepal and Bhutan on the south, where monsoon rains nurture forests of almost tropical abundance, and the stark, high-altitude deserts of Tibet to the north, where the blocked moisture creates landscapes of austere beauty reminiscent of the American Southwest, but at elevations where the air is too thin for most lowland life to survive. The rivers that were born from these rains became some of the most important characters in our mountain story, eventually growing into some of the greatest river systems on Earth. Three of the world's most significant rivers, the Indus, the Ganges, and the Brahmaputra, all have their origins in the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, making these mountains the source of water for more than 1 billion people across South and Southeast Asia. These rivers didn't simply flow around the mountains like streams, avoiding obstacles in their path. Instead, they became partners in the mountain-building process, carving deep valleys that allowed the peaks between them to rise even higher and more dramatically, creating the spectacular relief that makes the Himalayas so visually striking from both ground level and space. Imagine the Ganges in its infancy, when it was not yet the sacred river of millions of people, but simply a collection of streams gathering snowmelt and rainfall from the southern slopes of the rising mountains. As these streams joined together with the inevitable persistence of water seeking the sea, they began to cut deeper and deeper channels into the rising rock, creating the river valleys that would eventually become some of the most fertile and densely populated regions on Earth. The river was sculpting its own canyon while the mountains were still rising around it, locked in an eternal race between uplift and erosion that continues today with the same dynamic balance that has characterized the Himalayas for millions of years. Neither process dominates completely. Instead, they work together to create landscapes of extraordinary beauty and complexity. But it was perhaps the development of glaciers that truly transformed the Himalayas into the landscape of soaring peaks and deep valleys we know today, adding the final touches of artistic precision to mountains that were already magnificent. As the mountains grew taller with each passing millennium, their highest reaches began to experience temperatures cold enough for snow to persist year-round, even during the warmest seasons. Layer upon layer of snow accumulated on the highest peaks over thousands of years, gradually compacting into ice under its own weight, with the slow but inexorable transformation that turns soft snow into the blue-white hardness of glacial ice. Eventually, vast rivers of ice began to flow down the mountainsides like frozen waterfalls moving in extreme slow motion, following the paths of least resistance down valleys that they would gradually deepen and reshape according to the unique physics of ice flow. These glaciers became the master sculptors of the high Himalayas, working with a patience and precision that makes human artistry seem hasty by comparison. Unlike rivers, which primarily erode by carrying away loose material that has already been weathered from solid, rock glaciers work like enormous rasps or sanders, grinding directly against the bedrock with incredible force and methodical persistence that can reshape entire mountain faces given sufficient time. As they flow downslope under the influence of gravity, glaciers pluck away loose rocks from the valley floor and walls, incorporate them into the flowing ice mass, and use them as abrasive tools to grind against solid stone. The result is a gradual carving away of material that shapes valleys and ridges with the precision of master sculptors working in 3 dimensions to reveal the essential beauty hidden within the raw stone. Picture, if you will, the gradual transformation of a broad, rounded mountain into the sharp pyramid of a peak, like Everest or K2, a process that required millions of years of patient sculpting by ice working from multiple directions simultaneously. This transformation happened as glaciers flowing down different sides of the mountain gradually carved away material from all angles, like artists working collaboratively to reveal a form that none could create alone. The cirques, those bowl-shaped depressions where glaciers begin their journey downslope, cut deeper and deeper into the mountain's flanks over millions of years, creating the amphitheater-like basins that give many Himalayan peaks their distinctive architectural quality. Eventually, these circular basins carved so deeply into the mountains from multiple directions that only the narrow ridges between them remained, creating the knife-edge arêtes that seemed to slice the very air itself. The creation of these high-altitude landscapes also established one of the most beautiful and important features of the Himalayas, the zone of eternal snow that crowns the highest peaks like white silk scarves against the deep blue of high-altitude skies. Above a certain elevation, which varies with latitude and local climate conditions, but generally lies between 16,000 and 20,000 feet in the Himalayas, snow falls more frequently than it melts, creating the permanent snowfields and glaciers that define the character of the world's highest mountains. This zone of eternal snow became a kind of natural water tower for much of Asia, storing precipitation that falls during the cold months and releasing it gradually as meltwater during warmer periods. The high Himalayas essentially learned to capture water from the sky and parcel it out across the seasons, creating one of the most important hydrological systems on Earth and demonstrating how geological processes can create infrastructure that supports life across entire continents. The seasonal rhythm of this water storage and release system creates the predictable flood cycles that have supported agricultural civilizations in the river valleys below the mountains for thousands of years. During the spring and early summer, melting snow and ice from the high peaks feeds the rivers that irrigate the plains of northern India, while monsoon rains provide additional water during the growing season, creating a dual water supply system that has made some of the most densely populated regions on Earth possible. But the story of water in the Himalayas is not just about rivers flowing outward from the mountains toward distant oceans. Equally important and perhaps more poetic are the countless lakes that formed in the valleys carved by glaciers and rivers, creating some of the most beautiful and spiritually significant bodies of water on Earth. Some of these lakes are temporary features, formed when glacial dams block river valleys, creating bodies of water that may exist for centuries before the dams fail and drain catastrophically, reshaping entire valleys in a matter of hours or days. These glacial lake outburst floods, while potentially destructive, are also creative forces that carve new landscapes and create the dramatic gorges that characterize many Himalayan valleys. Other lakes are permanent features, nestled like blue jewels in high valleys, where they reflect the surrounding peaks like natural mirrors, creating some of the most photographed and spiritually revered landscapes on Earth. These high-altitude lakes often freeze solid during winter months and remain partially ice-covered even during summer, creating environments so pristine and beautiful they seem more like dreams than physical realities. The most famous of these high-altitude lakes might be the sacred lakes of Tibet and Nepal, places like Lake Manasarovar, which sits at more than 15,000 feet above sea level and is considered holy by multiple religions. These lakes represent the marriage of geological processes and human spirituality, places where the physical beauty created by mountain-building processes inspires reverence and wonder in all who encounter them, regardless of their cultural background or religious beliefs. As the Himalayas developed their mature form over millions of years of patient sculpting by ice and water, they also began to create their own local weather patterns that add another layer of complexity and beauty to these already spectacular landscapes. The high peaks generate their own winds as air heated on their sunny slopes rises and creates convection currents that interact with the broader atmospheric circulation patterns of the region. These local weather patterns can change rapidly and dramatically, creating the challenging and sometimes dangerous conditions that make high-altitude mountaineering both technically difficult and spiritually rewarding. The mountains learned to create their own storms, their own clear days, their own moments of crystalline beauty when the air is so clear it seems you could reach out and touch peaks that are actually dozens of miles away. The interplay between water and stone in the Himalayas created some of the most spectacular gorges on Earth, carved by rivers that refused to be deterred by the rising mountains in their path. As rivers cut deeper into the rising landscape, they created narrow canyons thousands of feet deep, like the famous Kali Gandaki Gorge in Nepal, which cuts between the peaks of Dhaulagiri and Annapurna to create what may be the deepest river valley in the world relative to the height of the surrounding peaks. These gorges are testimony to the incredible persistence of water, the ability of flowing streams to cut through solid rock, given enough time and patience, demonstrating that liquid water, despite its apparent fragility, can overcome any obstacle if it maintains its pressure steadily enough over sufficient time. The rivers essentially race the rising mountains, cutting down as fast as the peaks rise up, maintaining their courses through landscapes that are constantly trying to block their passage. The eternal snow of the high Himalayas also created one of the most beautiful and fragile ecosystems on Earth. The high-altitude environment where only specially adapted plants and animals can survive the combination of intense solar radiation, extreme temperature fluctuations, and atmospheric conditions that would be lethal to most forms of complex life. Above the tree line, in the zone where snow lies on the ground for most of the year, life takes on forms of extraordinary resilience and beauty. Tiny alpine flowers bloom in brief summer windows, their brilliant colors made even more intense by the clear, thin air and powerful solar radiation of high altitude. These plants must complete their entire reproductive cycle in just a few weeks of favorable conditions, creating displays of natural beauty that seem almost supernatural in their intensity and brevity. Snow leopards pad silently through landscapes of rock and ice, their thick fur and powerful legs perfectly adapted to hunting in environments where oxygen is scarce and temperatures can drop far below freezing even during summer months. These magnificent cats represent millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to extreme conditions, developing hunting strategies and physical characteristics that allow them to thrive in landscapes that challenge the limits of what complex life can tolerate. The hardy people who have learned to live in harmony with these extreme environments represent some of humanity's most remarkable adaptations to challenging landscapes. Communities like the Sherpa people of the Everest region have developed not just the physical adaptations necessary to thrive at high altitude, but also cultural practices and spiritual traditions that reflect deep understanding of mountain ecology and profound respect for the forces that shape their homeland. Through all these processes, the birth of monsoons, the carving of valleys, the formation of glaciers, the creation of eternal snowfields, the Himalayas were becoming more than just mountains. They were becoming the water tower of Asia, the climate creator of the continent, the source of rivers that would nourish civilizations, and the inspiration for spiritual traditions that would find in their soaring heights a natural symbol of transcendence and human aspiration toward the divine. And still, through all these changes and elaborations, the mountains continued to rise with the same patient persistence that had lifted them from ancient seafloors to their current heights. Their peaks climbed ever higher into the thin air of the upper atmosphere, their glaciers and snowfields expanding and contracting with ice ages and climate cycles, their rivers cutting ever deeper into their foundations while being fed by the eternal snows above. The Himalayas remain locked in the eternal dance between the forces that build mountains up and the forces that wear them down, a dance that has been continuing for millions of years and shows no sign of ending anytime soon, creating a dynamic equilibrium that sustains some of the most spectacular and spiritually inspiring landscapes our planet has ever produced. As the Himalayas matured into the towering realm we recognize today, something extraordinary began to happen in the valleys, on the slopes, and even on the highest reachable ledges of these mountains that transformed them from mere geological features into living, breathing ecosystems of stunning complexity and beauty. Life, in all its ingenious adaptability and creative persistence, began to colonize these new landscapes, creating communities of living beings so diverse and specialized that they seem more like fiction than natural history. From the steaming jungles at the base of the mountains to the windswept heights where only the hardiest creatures dare venture, the Himalayas became home to one of the most remarkable experiments in high-altitude living that our planet has ever conducted. This colonization didn't happen overnight, but over millions of years as species gradually adapted to the changing conditions created by the rising mountains, developing solutions to environmental challenges that push the very limits of what life can accomplish. Let us begin our gentle exploration in the foothills, where the great rivers emerging from the mountains have created some of the most fertile valleys in the world through millions of years of patient deposition. Here, in places like the Kathmandu Valley of Nepal or the river plains of northern India, the erosion of the mountains has deposited rich sediments that support lush forests and abundant wildlife in a demonstration of how geological processes create the foundation for biological abundance. These lowland regions became corridors for life, allowing species from different parts of Asia to meet, mingle, and evolve in the shelter of the great mountains. The foothills served as a mixing zone where northern and southern species encountered each other for the first time, creating opportunities for evolutionary innovation and biological exchange that enriched the diversity of life across the entire region. As we climb higher, following ancient paths that wind up through increasingly dramatic landscapes, we encounter one of the most remarkable transitions in the natural world. The gradual change from tropical abundance to alpine austerity, a transformation so complete It's like traveling from one planet to another simply by gaining elevation. At the base of the mountains, we might find ourselves walking through dense forests where orchids bloom in the canopy and tigers pad silently through the underbrush, their orange and black stripes perfectly camouflaged among the dappled shadows of the forest floor. But as we ascend, the character of life changes with almost every 1,000 feet of elevation gain, creating a vertical zonation of ecosystems that demonstrates life's incredible ability to adapt to changing conditions. The warm, humid forests of the foothills gradually give way to temperate woodlands, then to coniferous forests, then to alpine meadows, and finally to the stark, austere landscapes of the high peaks, where only the most specialized organisms can survive. The middle elevations of the Himalayas, between about 6,000 and 12,000 feet, became home to some of the most beautiful temperate forests on Earth, where conditions are cool enough to support conifers but warm enough to sustain incredible diversity. Here, rhododendrons grow to the size of oak trees, their brilliant flowers creating natural gardens that stretch for miles along the mountainsides in displays of color so intense they seem almost artificial. During blooming season, which typically occurs during the pre-monsoon months of April and May, entire valleys blaze with color, deep reds that seem to capture the intensity of sunset, bright pinks that rival any cultivated rose, pure whites that reflect the snow-capped peaks above. It's as if the mountains themselves were celebrating the return of spring with fireworks made of flowers, creating temporary art installations of natural beauty that last for just a few weeks before fading back into the green abundance of the growing season. In these middle elevation forests, life learned to adapt to the vertical nature of the landscape in ways that demonstrate evolution's incredible creativity when faced with unusual challenges. Trees that might grow on flat plains elsewhere found themselves clinging to steep slopes, their roots reaching deep into rocky soil to find purchase, and their trunks often growing at seemingly impossible angles as they reach toward available sunlight. Animals developed extraordinary climbing abilities that seem to defy gravity itself. The Himalayan tahr, a wild goat with thick fur and powerful legs, can navigate cliff faces that would challenge experienced human mountaineers, leaping between ledges with a confidence and grace that makes their movements look effortless despite the deadly consequences of a single misstep. Red pandas, those endearing creatures that look like a cross between a raccoon and a teddy bear, move through the forest canopy with an acrobatic grace that seems almost magical. Their semi-retractable claws and flexible ankles allow them to climb down trees head first, while their long, bushy tails serve as both balance poles and warm blankets during the cold nights that characterize high-altitude environments, even in relatively temperate zones. But perhaps no creature embodies the spirit of the Himalayas quite like the snow leopard, that ghostly predator that makes its home in the high alpine regions above the tree line, where the landscape becomes more like the surface of an alien planet than anything we might consider earthly. With its thick fur that changes color with the seasons, powerful legs that allow it to leap across chasms that would terrify most animals, and impossibly long tail that serves as both balance pole and warm blanket, the snow leopard represents millions of years of evolution specifically adapted to life in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. These magnificent cats hunt blue sheep and ibex across landscapes of rock and ice, moving with such stealth and grace that local people often call them mountain spirits or ghosts of the mountains. Their hunting strategies are perfectly adapted to the three-dimensional terrain of steep mountain slopes, where they can appear suddenly from above or disappear into rocky outcrops with an almost supernatural ability to blend with their surroundings. The high-altitude adaptations we see in Himalayan wildlife are almost miraculous in their ingenuity. demonstrating evolution's ability to solve problems that would seem impossible from an engineering perspective. The Tibetan antelope, or chiru, grows an undercoat so fine and warm that it has been prized by humans for centuries, leading unfortunately to its near extinction until recent conservation efforts began to protect these remarkable animals and their harsh, beautiful habitat. High-altitude birds like the bar-headed goose have developed cardiovascular systems so efficient they can fly directly over Mount Everest during their migrations, breathing air so thin that unacclimatized humans would lose consciousness in seconds. These geese have been tracked flying at altitudes above 29,000 feet, higher than the summit of Everest, navigating by landmarks and magnetic fields through skies where the air pressure is less than one-third that at sea level. Plant life in the high Himalayas displays equally remarkable adaptations to conditions that would kill most lowland species within hours. Above the tree line, where trees can no longer survive the combination of cold, wind, and thin air, we find alpine meadows of extraordinary beauty that seem to concentrate all the color and life of lower elevations into brief, intense displays that last only during the short summer growing season. During these few weeks of favorable conditions, alpine meadows explode with wild flowers that seem to glow with their own internal light. Blue poppies that seem to capture pieces of sky in their delicate petals, primulas in shades of purple and yellow that carpet entire hillsides like living rainbows, and tiny cushion plants that grow in perfect domes to conserve warmth and moisture in environments where every calorie of energy and every drop of water must be carefully conserved. These plants must complete their entire reproductive cycle in just a few weeks of favorable conditions, from sprouting through flowering to seed production, before winter returns and buries the landscape under snow for 8 or 9 months of the year. It's a biological sprint that requires incredible efficiency and perfect timing, creating some of the most intense displays of natural beauty anywhere on Earth. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of life in the Himalayas is the way human cultures developed in harmony with these extreme environments over thousands of years, creating ways of life that work with rather than against the rhythms of the mountains. For millennia, people have made their homes in valleys and on plateaus that would seem uninhabitable to outsiders, developing technologies, social systems, and spiritual practices that reflect deep understanding of mountain ecology and profound respect for the forces that shape their homeland. The Sherpa people of the Everest region, whose very name has become synonymous with high-altitude expertise and mountain wisdom, developed not just the physical adaptations necessary to thrive at elevations where most lowlanders would suffer from altitude sickness, but also cultural practices that reflect generations of accumulated knowledge about living safely in environments where weather can change from pleasant to deadly within hours. Tibetans living on the high plateau have developed physiological adaptations that allow them to thrive at elevations above 12,000 feet, where the air contains 40% less oxygen than at sea level. These adaptations include enlarged lung capacity, more efficient oxygen carrying capacity in their blood, and cardiovascular systems that can function effectively in conditions that would stress lowland populations beyond their limits. The diverse ethnic groups of the Middle Hills, Gurung, Tamang, Rai, Limbu, and dozens of others, each developed distinct cultures that reflect their specific relationships with particular mountain environments. Some became specialists in high-altitude agriculture, creating terraced fields that transform steep mountainsides into productive farmland. Others developed expertise in animal husbandry, learning to manage yaks, sheep, and goats in environments where seasonal migrations between different elevations are necessary for survival. These mountain cultures created some of humanity's most beautiful expressions of spiritual connection to landscape, developing religious and philosophical traditions that recognize the mountains as sacred spaces deserving of reverence and respect. Tibetan Buddhism, with its emphasis on compassion, interdependence, and the recognition of suffering as a fundamental aspect of existence, seems perfectly suited to life in an environment where survival depends on cooperation and respect for natural forces beyond human control. The prayer flags that flutter from ridgelines throughout the Himalayas carry mantras and prayers into the wind, creating a constant dialogue between human aspiration and mountain atmosphere. These colorful pieces of cloth serve as both spiritual practice and practical weather indicators, their movement indicating wind direction and strength to travelers navigating through landscapes where weather awareness can mean the difference between life and death. The traditional architecture of Himalayan peoples reflects thousands of years of adaptation to extreme conditions, demonstrating how human creativity can solve the challenges of living in environments that test the limits of habitability. Houses are built low and thick-walled to withstand fierce winds that can exceed 100 miles per hour, with flat roofs designed to shed snow efficiently while providing space for drying crops and storing fuel during the brief summer months. Many traditional homes include elaborate systems for capturing and storing heat from scarce fuel sources using techniques like thermal mass and passive solar design that modern architects are only beginning to rediscover. Homes are often built partially underground or into hillsides, using the Earth's natural insulation to maintain comfortable temperatures, even when outside conditions would be lethal. Terraced fields carved into steep mountainsides represent some of the most sophisticated agricultural engineering in the world, creating flat planting surfaces on slopes so steep they seem to defy gravity. These terraces, some of which have been maintained continuously for hundreds of years, prevent erosion while creating microclimates that allow crops to grow at elevations and latitudes where agriculture would otherwise be impossible. But the relationship between humans and the Himalayas goes beyond mere adaptation to challenging conditions. It includes a deep spiritual dimension that recognizes these mountains as sacred spaces that transcend their physical reality. Many peaks are considered the homes of gods and goddesses, places too holy for human feet to tread, where the boundary between earth and heaven becomes beautifully blurred. Mount Kailash in Tibet is sacred to 4 different religions: Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Bon, making it one of the most universally revered mountains on Earth. Despite being technically climbable, it remains unclimbed out of respect for its sacred status, demonstrating how spiritual values can take precedence over human ambition even in our achievement-oriented modern world. Peaks like Machapuchari in Nepal, known as Fishtail Peak for its distinctive double summit, remain unclimbed out of respect for local beliefs that consider them sacred. This voluntary restraint represents a beautiful balance between human capability and cultural respect, showing how traditional values can coexist with modern mountaineering culture. The biological diversity of the Himalayas is staggering in both its scope and its uniqueness. These mountains are home to more than 10,000 plant species, hundreds of bird species, and dozens of large mammal species, many found nowhere else on Earth. This diversity exists because the Himalayas create so many different ecological niches within relatively small geographical areas, from tropical lowlands to Arctic-like summits, often within just a few miles of vertical distance. The rapid change in elevation creates what biologists call sky islands, isolated pockets of habitat that support species that cannot survive in the surrounding environments. These islands of suitable habitat become evolutionary laboratories where species can develop unique characteristics in isolation from their relatives, leading to the high levels of endemism that characterize Himalayan flora and fauna. The seasonal rhythms of life in the Himalayas follow the ancient patterns of monsoon and winter, abundance and scarcity, in cycles that have been repeating for millions of years with the reliability of planetary mechanics. During the brief summer growing season, the mountains explode with activity. Flowers bloom in displays of color that seem to concentrate all the beauty of an entire year into just a few weeks. Animals breed and raise their young in frantic preparation for winter, and people move their livestock to high pastures to take advantage of the short season of abundance. But as winter approaches with the inevitability of geological time, life retreats to lower elevations or enters dormancy, waiting patiently for the return of warmth and the renewal of the cycle. This rhythm of expansion and contraction, abundance and scarcity, creates the pulse that drives adaptation and evolution in mountain environments, selecting for species that can make the most of brief opportunities while surviving long periods of hardship. Even today, as the modern world increasingly encroaches on these ancient landscapes through tourism, development, and climate change, the Himalayas continue to harbor secrets and surprises that remind us how much we still don't know about life on our own planet. New species are discovered regularly in remote valleys, while conservation efforts work to protect endangered creatures like the snow leopard, red panda, and Himalayan black bear. The mountains that rose from ancient seas continue to be a crucible for evolution, a laboratory where life experiments with the possibilities of existence at the edge of the habitable world. From the smallest alpine flower that blooms for just a few days each year, to the most elusive snow leopard hunting across landscapes of stone and ice, from traditional mountain cultures that have maintained sustainable relationships with harsh environments for thousands of years, to modern conservation efforts that seek to protect these landscapes for future generations. The story of life in the Himalayas is ultimately a story of adaptation, resilience, and the incredible creativity of evolution when faced with extreme challenges. It demonstrates the beautiful truth that wherever conditions exist for life to flourish, life will find a way. Not just to survive, but to create communities of stunning beauty and remarkable complexity that enrich our understanding of what's possible on our extraordinary planet. And through it all, the mountains themselves continue their patient rise toward the sky, creating new habitats even as they transform existing ones, serving as both the foundation and the inspiration for one of the most extraordinary experiments in high-altitude living that our planet has ever known, a testament to life's incredible ability to adapt, thrive, and create beauty even in the most challenging environments our Earth can provide. As we draw near to the present moment in our geological journey through deep time, we encounter perhaps the most remarkable truth about the Himalayas. These ancient mountains are not finished with their story. Far from being static monuments to past geological events, preserved like fossils of ancient processes, they remain vibrantly alive, continuing to grow, change, and reshape themselves with each passing day in a demonstration that our planet remains as geologically active today as it was millions of years ago. The collision that began 50 million years ago continues today with the same inexorable force that originally lifted seafloor into sky, and the mountains born from that patient embrace are still reaching toward the heavens with the same quiet persistence that has characterized their entire existence. Each year brings measurable growth. Each earthquake represents adjustment and accommodation to ongoing stresses. Each season brings changes that contribute to the continuing evolution of these magnificent landscapes. Imagine, if you will, the Himalayas as a vast, slow-breathing entity. Their breath measured not in seconds, but in centuries, not in heartbeats, but in the gradual pulse of tectonic forces deep beneath the Earth's surface that continue to drive India northward into Asia with unstoppable momentum. Each year, these mountains grow approximately 4 millimeters taller, a measurement so small it seems insignificant, until we remember that this tiny annual increment has accumulated over millions of years to create the highest peaks on our planet. This ongoing growth is not uniform across the entire range, creating a complex pattern of differential uplift that reflects the continuing collision between India and Asia in all its geological complexity. Different parts of the Himalayas are rising at different rates, like sections of an enormous accordion being slowly compressed by forces so vast they defy easy comprehension. The central Himalayas, including the Everest region that captures so much human attention and imagination, are rising fastest, while the eastern and western ends of the range are growing more slowly in response to the varying geometry of the continental collision. Modern GPS stations scattered across the range can measure this ongoing growth in real time, providing scientists with unprecedented insights into how mountain building works at scales that were previously impossible to observe directly. These measurements reveal that the Himalayas are not just growing taller, but also moving horizontally as different parts of the range adjust to the continuing collision in ways that create a complex, three-dimensional pattern of motion that resembles a very slow dance choreographed by tectonic forces. But the story of the living Himalayas involves more than just steady upward growth, driven by the inexorable collision of continental plates. These mountains are also active seismically, regularly adjusting to the enormous stresses placed upon them by the continuing collision through earthquakes that represent the mountain's way of breathing, of relieving pressure and accommodating change in sudden bursts of energy release that can reshape entire valleys in a matter of seconds. Earthquakes in the Himalayas are not catastrophic interruptions of an otherwise stable system. They are part of the natural breathing of the mountains, sudden releases of energy that allow the range to accommodate its ongoing growth and transformation without building up stresses that would eventually tear the entire system apart. Each earthquake, while potentially devastating for the people who experience it, represents a small adjustment in the grand scheme of Himalayan geology, a moment when the mountains suddenly shift to relieve pressure that has been building for centuries or millennia. The Great Nepal earthquake of 2015, devastating as it was for the people who lived through its terrifying minutes of ground-shaking violence, was actually a relatively small adjustment in the grand scheme of Himalayan geology, a moment when a small portion of the range suddenly shifted to relieve pressure that had been building for hundreds of years. The GPS measurements taken before and after the earthquake showed that some peaks actually moved several feet in a matter of seconds, while others dropped slightly as the mountains adjusted their configuration to accommodate new stresses created by the sudden motion. These seismic adjustments are part of what keeps the Himalayas growing, despite the constant forces of erosion that work to level them. Without earthquakes to relieve stress and allow new configurations of rock to form, the tectonic forces pushing the mountains upward would eventually reach a balance with gravitational forces pulling them down, and the range would stop growing. The fact that the Himalayas continue to rise means that they haven't yet reached this equilibrium. The collision between India and Asia is still active enough to keep pushing these ancient seafloors higher into the sky. The living nature of the Himalayas is also evident in their continuing interaction with climate and weather patterns in ways that create feedback loops between geological and atmospheric processes. As the mountains grow taller, they become increasingly effective at blocking air masses and creating the precipitation patterns that feed their own glaciers and rivers, which in turn carve deeper valleys that allow peaks to grow even taller, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that has sustained mountain building for millions of years. This creates a beautiful example of how geological and atmospheric systems can work together to maintain conditions that support their mutual development. The mountains grow tall enough to capture moisture from the air, which feeds glaciers that carve valleys that allow peaks to grow even taller, which makes them even more effective at capturing moisture from the sky in an upward spiral that has lifted these ranges to their current extraordinary heights. But this same system that has allowed the Himalayas to grow to their current heights is now being affected by human-induced climate change in ways that are altering both the appearance of the mountains and their role as water towers for Asia. The glaciers that have been sculpting these mountains for millions of years are retreating rapidly as global temperatures rise, changing both the appearance of the mountains and their ability to store and release water according to seasonal patterns that billions of people depend on for agriculture and survival. The eternal snows that have crowned the highest peaks for millions of years may not be eternal after all, at least not on human timescales that matter for the civilizations that depend on glacial meltwater for their survival. This creates one of the most poignant aspects of the contemporary Himalayan story, the way ancient geological processes are being affected by rapid changes in global climate that operate on timescales much faster than the mountains can adapt to. Yet even as some aspects of the Himalayan system are changing rapidly in response to human activities, the fundamental geological processes continue with the same patience they have shown for millions of years, demonstrating the incredible stability of tectonic forces compared to the relatively rapid changes occurring in Earth's atmosphere and climate systems. India continues its northward push into Asia at a rate of about 2 inches per year, faster than the mountains grow, which means that the collision is actually intensifying rather than slowing down over time. The basement rocks of the Indian subcontinent continue to slide beneath Tibet, thickening the crust and providing the foundation for continued mountain building that will persist long after current climate changes have been resolved one way or another. The rivers that drain the Himalayas also continue their ancient work of erosion, carving ever deeper valleys and carrying the sediments of the mountains towards the sea in a process that has been continuing since the mountains first began to rise. The Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers transport more than 1 billion tons of Himalayan sediment each year, gradually wearing down the mountains even as tectonic forces build them up in the eternal dance between construction and destruction that characterizes all mountain ranges. This erosion doesn't just remove material from the mountains, it actually contributes to their growth by removing weight from their peaks and allowing them to rise more freely in response to tectonic pressure, like corks bobbing higher in water when weight is removed from their tops. The relationship between erosion and uplift in the Himalayas is so closely balanced that changes in one process immediately affect the other, creating a dynamic equilibrium that has sustained these mountains at their current heights for millions of years. Modern technology has given us unprecedented insights into the complex ways the Himalayas continue to grow and change, providing real-time measurements of processes that were previously invisible except over geological timescales. Satellite measurements can detect millimeter-scale changes in mountain heights, while networks of seismic monitors track the constant small earthquakes that represent the mountains adjusting to ongoing stresses with the precision of mechanical instruments. GPS stations scattered across the range provide real-time measurements of how different parts of the mountains are moving relative to each other, creating a detailed picture of a mountain range in constant, subtle motion that resembles the breathing of some enormous geological organism. These measurements reveal that the Himalayas are not just growing taller, but also spreading laterally, rotating slightly, and adjusting their internal structure in response to the continuing collision in ways that demonstrate the incredible complexity of mountain-building processes. Perhaps most remarkably, recent research has shown that the Himalayas may actually be growing faster now than they did in the past, accelerated by climate changes that are reducing the weight of ice pressing down on the peaks. As glaciers retreat and reduce the load on the mountains, the peaks are able to rise more freely in response to tectonic forces, creating a process called glacial isostatic rebound that means climate change may actually be accelerating the growth of the mountains even as it transforms their appearance and ecology. This discovery represents one of the most unexpected connections between human activities and geological processes, showing how changes in Earth's climate system can affect even the most fundamental processes of mountain building in ways that scientists are only beginning to understand. The same warming that threatens the glaciers that have sculpted these peaks for millions of years may also be allowing them to grow taller, faster than they have in the recent geological past. The living, breathing nature of the Himalayas extends beyond geological processes to include their ongoing role in shaping weather patterns, supporting evolving ecosystems, and inspiring human cultures that continue to develop in response to changing mountain environments. As the mountains continue to grow and change, they continue to influence monsoon patterns across Asia, provide habitat for species that are still evolving in response to high-altitude conditions, and serve as sources of spiritual inspiration for millions of people who find in their soaring heights natural symbols of transcendence and aspiration. The future of the Himalayas stretches out over geological timescales that dwarf human history, extending into deep time in ways that challenge our ability to imagine such vast spans of future existence. The collision between India and Asia will continue for millions of years to come, gradually pushing these mountains even higher into the sky, as long as the forces driving continental drift continue to operate according to the deep thermal dynamics of our planet's interior. Eventually, perhaps 10 or 20 million years from now, the collision may slow as India becomes fully incorporated into Asia, and the geometry of the continental margins changes to reduce the effectiveness of the driving forces. When this happens, erosion will begin to dominate over uplift, and these magnificent peaks will gradually be worn down by the same patient forces of wind, water, and ice that carved their current beauty, returning their materials to the sea from which they originally rose. But that future is so distant it seems more like mythology than scientific prediction, separated from our current moment by spans of time so vast they make the entire history of human civilization seem like a brief afternoon in the life of the mountains. For now, and for millions of years to come, the Himalayas remain what they have always been, a testament to the incredible patience and power of geological processes, a reminder that even the most solid and permanent-seeming features of our world are part of an endless dance of change and transformation. They continue to rise toward the sky with the same quiet persistence that lifted ancient seafloors into the highest places on Earth, breathing slowly in geological time, growing grain by grain, earthquake by earthquake, toward heights we can barely imagine. Each measurement of their current growth represents a continuation of processes that have been operating for millions of years and will continue for millions more, demonstrating the incredible stability and persistence of the forces that shape our planet. In this sense, the Himalayas teach us perhaps the most important lesson of geological time: that patience and persistence can accomplish things that seem impossible, that the most dramatic transformations often happen so slowly they seem like stillness, and that our planet remains a dynamic, living system capable of creating beauty on scales that humble and inspire us in equal measure. The living mountains continue their ancient conversation with the sky, growing imperceptibly taller with each breath of geological time, patient and eternal guardians of one of the most beautiful stories our planet has ever told, reminders that we live on a world that is still actively creating itself, still growing and changing and discovering new ways to be magnificent, 1 millimeter at a time, one earthquake at a time, one season at a time, forever and ever, world without end. And so we come to the end of our gentle journey through deep time, our peaceful pilgrimage from ancient oceans to soaring summits, from the patient collision of continents to the birth of the highest mountains on Earth. As our story draws to a close like the last light fading from mountain peaks at twilight, let us rest together for a moment in the thin, crystalline air of the high Himalayas, surrounded by peaks that began their impossible journey on the floor of a vanished sea and now stand as silent guardians between earth and sky, between the possible and the eternal. Picture yourself, if you will, lying on a comfortable ledge high in the mountains as twilight settles over the peaks like the softest blanket imaginable, woven from starlight and mountain air. The day's warmth still radiates gently from the stone beneath you, while the first cool breath of evening brings with it the scent of snow and the infinite silence that exists only in the highest places on Earth. The air around you is perfectly still, so clear and pure it seems to carry the light of stars, even before they become visible in the deepening blue of the sky. Each breath you take connects you directly to the vast atmospheric ocean that surrounds our planet, while beneath you, the ancient limestone remembers its origin in warm, tropical seas where creatures lived and died millions of years ago, never imagining their shells would one day rest at elevations where eagles soar and the curve of the earth becomes visible on the horizon. Around you, the great peaks rise like ancient prayers carved in stone and ice, their summits catching the last golden rays of sunlight, while their bases fade into gentle purple shadow that seems to hold all the peace the world has ever known. Everest, Lhotse, Makalu, Cho-Oyu. Each peak tells part of the story we've shared together, each ridge and face carved by millions of years of patient collaboration between ice and stone, wind and weather, time and the inexorable forces that lift sea floor toward stars. This is perhaps the most beautiful moment to contemplate the incredible journey that brought us here together. The story of how ancient ocean became eternal summit, how tropical coral reefs became snow-crowned peaks, how the patient collision of continents created landscapes so spectacular they seem to belong more to dreams than to the solid, measurable world of geological science. In the perfect stillness of this high place, surrounded by the monuments to deep time that stretch in every direction, we can almost sense the slow pulse of geological processes continuing their ancient work. The mountains are still growing, still rising millimeter by millimeter toward greater heights, still engaged in their eternal dance with the forces of erosion that carve their beauty while trying to level their grandeur. The limestone beneath Mount Everest's summit still remembers warm seas and coral reefs, still carries within its crystalline structure the fossilized remains of creatures that built their shells in tropical waters millions of years before the first flower bloomed on land. The granite peaks of K2 and Kangchenjunga recall the deep pressures and temperatures that forged them far beneath ancient continents, while the slate and marble of the middle ranges preserve the memory of ancient mudflats and beaches that knew the gentle lapping of waves in seas that no longer exist. Every grain of sand carried by Himalayan rivers toward distant oceans is part of a conversation between mountain and sea that has been continuing for millions of years and will continue for millions more. A dialogue conducted in the patient language of erosion and deposition, uplift and weathering, the eternal recycling of materials that makes our planet a living, breathing system rather than a static collection of rocks and water. We are surrounded here by the physical memory of our planet, written in a language of stone and ice that speaks of patience, transformation, and the endless creativity of geological processes working across timescales so vast they challenge our human ability to comprehend them even intellectually. These mountains are libraries of deep time, archives of ancient environments, museums of vanished worlds that continue to exist as solid reminders of our planet's incredible capacity for self-transformation. As the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above us, like pinpricks of light in a vast, dark fabric, we can reflect on the profound lessons embedded in this mountain story that we've shared together across the comfortable darkness of this evening. The Himalayas teach us that the most dramatic changes often happen so slowly they seem like stillness to any observer living within them, that the most powerful forces work through gentle persistence rather than violent action, and that time itself is perhaps the most creative force in the universe. There's something deeply comforting about geological time, isn't there? In a world that often seems to move too quickly, where change happens at overwhelming speeds that leave us breathless and disoriented, the mountains remind us that the most beautiful and lasting transformations require patience, measured not in years or decades, but in millions of years of steady, persistent effort toward seemingly impossible goals. They show us that even continents can learn to dance together across the vast ballroom of ocean basins, that even the deepest seas can be transformed into the highest peaks, and that our planet remains endlessly capable of creating beauty on scales that humble and inspire us, while teaching us about the power of persistence, patience, and faith in processes that work too slowly for any individual lifetime to comprehend. The story of the Himalayas is ultimately a love story, the tale of how our Earth expresses its deepest creative impulses through the slow sculpture of stone and ice, through the patient marriage of tectonic forces and weather patterns, through the gradual lifting of ancient memories into the light of present skies where they can inspire wonder in creatures like us who live for just brief moments in geological time, but carry within ourselves the capacity for awe and reverence. It's a reminder that we live on a planet that is still actively creating itself, still growing and changing and discovering new ways to be beautiful, still experimenting with the possibilities of what landscapes can become when given enough time and the right conditions. The Himalayas are not finished. They continue to rise, continue to change, continue to evolve in response to the same forces that lifted them from ancient seafloors to their current magnificent heights. As we prepare to leave this high place and return to the rhythms of our daily lives, carrying with us the peace and perspective that only mountains can provide, let us take with us something of their patience, their quiet confidence that slow and steady transformation can accomplish miracles that seem impossible when viewed from the limited perspective of human timescales. Let us remember that we too are part of the ongoing story of this remarkable planet, that our brief lives unfold within the same creative processes that built these peaks and will continue to shape our world long after we have returned to the elements from which we came. We are made of the same materials as these mountains, calcium from ancient sea creatures, iron forged in the hearts of dying stars, carbon that has cycled through countless living beings across billions of years of Earth history. The mountains will keep their vigil through the night, their peaks standing like beacons against the star-filled sky, continuing their ancient rise toward heaven with the same quiet persistence that has lifted them from seafloor to summit. They will continue to grow, grain by grain, year by year, reminding anyone who takes the time to listen that patience and time can accomplish anything, that the most solid-seeming realities are part of an endless, beautiful dance of change and transformation. Tomorrow the sun will rise over these peaks as it has for millions of years, painting them in shades of gold and rose that seem too beautiful to be real, too perfect to be the product of mere physical processes. The glaciers will continue their patient work of sculpture, carrying on conversations with stone that began millions of years ago, and will continue long after. Our species has learned new ways to listen to the deep wisdom of geological time. The rivers will carry mountain sediments toward distant seas, returning materials to the oceans from which they originally came in the eternal recycling that makes our planet a living system rather than a static collection of rocks and water. The eternal snows will catch and hold the light like crystalline prayers offered to the sky, while the prayer flags of mountain peoples flutter in winds that carry human hopes and aspirations into the vast atmospheric ocean that surrounds our world. Before we part ways on this peaceful evening, I want to thank you for sharing this journey through deep time, for allowing your imagination to drift with me across geological ages and impossible transformations, for opening your heart to the patient wisdom that mountains have to offer anyone willing to listen to their slow, deep songs of stone and time. If you found comfort and wonder in this story of patient mountains and ancient seas, I hope you'll consider joining our gentle community of sleepy explorers by subscribing to these journeys into the peaceful corners of our Earth's memory. There are so many more stories waiting to be shared. Tales of other mountains, other oceans, other impossible transformations that our beautiful planet has accomplished through the quiet magic of geological time and the endless creativity of natural processes working across scales that inspire humility and wonder in equal measure. Until we meet again among the peaceful landscapes of our Earth's memory, may you carry with you something of the mountains' patience, their quiet confidence in the power of slow and steady transformation, and their reminder that we live on a planet that continues to create beauty on scales that transcend our ability to comprehend, yet remain accessible to our capacity for reverence and awe. Sleep well, dear wanderer, and dream of ancient seas becoming eternal snows, of continents dancing across deep time, and of mountains that know the secret of lifting the impossible into the realm of stars, one patient millimeter at a time. The Himalayas will keep their silent vigil through the night, continuing their ancient conversation with the sky, growing imperceptibly taller with each breath of geological time, patient and eternal guardians of one of the most beautiful stories our planet has ever told. They rise like living prayers made of stone and ice, like frozen symphonies composed by forces beyond human comprehension, yet accessible to human wonder, like monuments to the incredible patience required to transform the impossible into the inevitable through nothing more than persistence, time, and the deep faith that all things change, all things grow, all things reach toward greater heights when given the gift of enough time to accomplish their dreams. Sweet dreams, and thank you for this journey among the peaks, where ancient oceans learned to touch the stars and show us that anything is possible in the patient embrace of deep time, where every grain of stone carries the memory of vanished worlds, and every breath of mountain air connects us to the vast living systems that make our planet the most beautiful and creative place we know in all the universe. The mountains sing their lullabies in frequencies too low for human ears, but perfectly audible to human hearts that know how to listen for the deep rhythms of patience, persistence, and the endless capacity for transformation that makes our Earth not just a place to live, but a source of constant wonder, inspiration, and peace for anyone willing to rest quietly in the presence of such ancient, patient majesty. Good night, dear friend of mountains and seas, of stone and time, of patience and the beautiful inevitability of change. Sweet dreams among the peaks.